Everyone knows about Tarawa. At least, they think they do. A tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific. A few hundred acres of coral and sand that nobody had ever heard of before November 1943. A battle that lasted 76 hours. A death toll so staggering, it shocked even the generals who ordered the assault. But here is what most people do not know. The worst part of Tarawa did not happen during the fighting. It happened before a single Marine fired a single shot. It happened the moment the landing craft hit the reef and stopped, dead in the water, hundreds of yards from shore. In full view of Japanese gunners who had spent 16 months turning that beach into a fortress. If you want to understand what the Marines discovered at Tarawa, you have to understand what they were supposed to find. And then you have to understand how catastrophically, how lethally wrong every single one of those assumptions turned out to be. So stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than most people realize. And if you find yourself gripped by the kind of history that actually matters, the kind that was paid for in blood, then make sure you subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. Let us start at the beginning. Not at the beach, not at the reef, but at the planning tables. Months before the first Marine ever set foot on a landing craft, because that is where the disaster truly began. By mid-1943, the United States was in the full swing of its island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. The strategy was elegant in theory: seize key island chains, build airfields, choke off Japanese supply lines, and press steadily toward the home islands. But to do that, the Americans needed to crack open the Gilbert Islands, a chain of low-lying atolls about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. And the crown jewel of the Gilberts, the most heavily fortified, the most strategically vital, was Betio Island, the main island of Tarawa Atoll. Betio was small, shockingly small. It was shaped roughly like a bird in flight, barely 2 miles long, and less than half a mile wide at its widest point. You could walk the perimeter in about an hour. The entire island was barely 300 acres, but what the Japanese had done to those 300 acres was extraordinary. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the garrison, and he reportedly told his men that the Americans could not take Betio with 1 million men in 100 years. He was not entirely wrong about what he had built. The island had been fortified over 16 months into one of the most formidable defensive positions in the Pacific theater. There were more than 500 individual defensive installations, 14 coastal defense guns, including 8-inch guns removed from Singapore, dozens of anti-boat guns, anti-aircraft batteries, machine gun nests, light artillery pieces, and mortar positions. The entire perimeter of the island was ringed with barbed wire, log barriers, and steel obstacles designed to funnel any landing force into kill zones. The garrison numbered roughly 4,500 men, the majority of them special naval landing forces, Japan's elite equivalent of Marines, veterans who had trained specifically for this kind of fixed defense. These were not conscripts. These were professionals who believed they would die where they stood, and intended to take as many Americans with them as possible. The beaches were covered, the approaches were covered, the sea lanes were covered, and the reef, the long, flat, deadly reef that surrounded Betio on all sides, well, the Japanese believed the reef was the most effective defensive barrier of all, because any landing craft that tried to cross it would either ground on the coral or be torn apart by gunfire while it sat there unable to move. And here is where the American planners made their critical, their fatal mistake. The planners knew about the reef. Of course they knew. Aerial photographs clearly showed it extending several hundred yards from the beach on the lagoon side, which was where the main assault was planned. The reef at Betio was a broad, flat shelf of dead coral that sat just below or just above the surface of the water, depending on the tides. And that word tides is where everything began to fall apart. The success of the entire landing depended on one assumption, that there would be enough water over the reef, enough depth, to float the Higgins boats, the LCVP landing craft, over the coral and carry the Marines all the way to the shoreline. The planners estimated they needed at least 5 feet of water over the reef for that to work, and based on their calculations of the tidal cycle, they believed they would have it on the morning of November 20th, 1943. They were wrong. But it was not a simple miscalculation. It was a convergence of failures, each one compounding the next, each one impossible to correct once the assault was already in motion. The first failure was intelligence. The Americans had very limited precise information about the specific tidal patterns around Betio. They had charts, they had estimates, they had some pre-war survey data, and they had the observations of a New Zealand officer named Major Frank Holland, who had spent time in the Gilberts before the war. Holland was practically begging anyone who would listen to pay attention to what he knew about the reef. He warned that the tides at Tarawa were notoriously unpredictable, that the region was prone to what local mariners called a dodging tide, a condition where the normal tidal cycle would simply fail to produce the expected rise in water. Instead of the 5 feet the planners were counting on, the water over the reef might be as shallow as 3 feet, or even less. Holland said it plainly. He said there might not be enough water to float the boats over the reef. Some senior officers listened. Most dismissed him. The assault was scheduled, and the assumptions held firm. On the night of November 19, the fleet assembled offshore. It was one of the largest naval concentrations the Pacific War had yet seen. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and specialized landing ships. The Marines of the 2nd Division were ready. They had trained hard. They were motivated, and they believed in the mission. What they did not know, what they could not have been told because nobody knew for certain, was that the tide on the morning of November 20th, 1943, was going to be one of the worst possible tidal conditions that could have greeted an amphibious assault. It was going to be, in the grim language of the after-action reports, an extremely neap tide. What that means requires a quick detour into basic oceanography, because understanding it is essential to understanding what those Marines walked into. The ocean does not just have one tide. The height of the tide at any given location on any given day is the result of the combined gravitational pull of the moon and the sun acting on the ocean. When the moon and sun are aligned, their gravitational forces combine, and you get what are called spring tides, the highest high tides and the lowest low tides. When the moon and sun are at right angles to each other, their forces partially cancel out, and you get neap tides, the most moderate tides with the smallest difference between high and low water. At Tarawa, neap tides meant the water simply did not rise high enough to provide adequate depth over the reef. And on November 20th, 1943, the tidal conditions produced exactly what Major Holland had warned about: the dodging tide. The water over the reef at Bedio's Lagoon was roughly 3 feet deep in many places. Some sections were shallower. Bare coral teeth were breaking the surface in places where the planners had assumed 5 feet of open water. The Higgins boats, the LCVP landing craft that were carrying the bulk of the assault waves, drew about 3.5 feet when loaded with troops and equipment. They were going to ground. They were going to stop, hundreds of yards from the beach, in full view of everything the Japanese had built. Now here is where you need to picture the scene as clearly as possible, because the scale of the catastrophe that followed only makes sense if you can visualize what the Marines were facing. The lagoon side assault involved 3 beaches designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. The landing was to be made in multiple waves, each wave a line of landing craft pushing toward shore. The first 3 waves were not in Higgins boats. They were in LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, also called Amtraks or alligators. These were amphibious tractors that could crawl over coral and continue moving on land. They were the salvation of the first waves, but there were not enough of them. The assault plan called for the first 3 waves to go in LVTs, with subsequent waves following in Higgins boats once, theoretically, the LVTs had established a beachhead and the tide had risen sufficiently to float the Higgins boats over the reef. Everything about that plan was about to collapse. When the first LVTs crossed the reef and churned toward the beach, the Japanese opened up with everything they had. The pre-landing bombardment had been impressive on paper. Battleships and cruisers poured thousands of rounds onto Bedio for about 2.5 hours before the assault. Aircraft strafed and bombed. The island disappeared in smoke and fire, and the Americans watching from offshore thought nothing could have survived. They were wrong. The Japanese positions had been built to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. The main gun positions were protected by log and coral walls several feet thick, reinforced with steel plate and concrete in some cases. The bunkers had roofs of coconut logs layered 4 and 5 feet deep, covered with sand and coral. The bombardment killed some of the defenders and destroyed some of the positions, but the majority of the garrison survived it. They sheltered in their fortifications, waited for the shelling to lift, and then came back to their guns. And when the first LVTs appeared crawling toward the beach, they were waiting. The first wave took heavy fire. Marines were killed in the LVTs before they ever reached shore. The tracked vehicles ground up over the beach and the survivors poured out and immediately ran into a wall of fire. There was almost no cover on the beach itself. A low log seawall ran along much of the lagoon shore, maybe 3 or 4 feet high, and Marines dove behind it and tried to press themselves flat while machine gun and rifle fire swept over them and mortars began to fall. But the first wave, shattered as it was, at least made it to the beach. The second and third waves in LVTs also crossed the reef and made it to shore, though with heavy casualties. And then came the fourth wave, and the fourth wave was in Higgins boats, and the Higgins boats hit the reef and stopped. The Marines in those boats heard the grinding of the hull on coral and felt the sudden lurch of the craft coming to a halt. They looked at the ramps, looked at each other, and then the boat crews or the boat commanders made the call that there was nothing else to do. The ramp went down. Or in some cases, the Marines simply went over the sides, and they stepped into the water. What they found was between 3 and 4 feet of water over the reef in most places. The reef itself was jagged, uneven coral, slippery and sharp, invisible in the churned and discolored water. The water was warm. It was also alive with Japanese fire. Machine guns on the beach, light artillery, and rifle fire immediately began sweeping the approaches. The Japanese gunners had ranged on the reef long before the battle. They knew exactly where any landing craft would stop, and exactly how long it would take men on foot to cross several hundred yards of open water while carrying full combat loads. They opened up, and men began to die. What the Marines discovered when those landing craft grounded on the reef was not just an obstacle, it was a death trap of the most specific and measurable kind. They discovered that they were somewhere between 500 and 800 yards from the beach, depending on exactly where their craft had grounded on the reef. They were in water between their knees and their armpits, depending on the depth at that specific point, and depending on their individual height. They were carrying weapons, ammunition, packs, radios, and all the equipment of an assault wave. Some men were carrying equipment that was extremely heavy. Weapons platoons carried machine guns, mortars, and their associated ammunition. Radio operators had sets that weighed dozens of pounds. Every additional pound meant slower movement through water and more chance of being knocked off balance on the uneven coral and going under. They discovered that the Japanese had pre-registered fire on the exact zones where they now stood. Heavy machine guns firing at the rate of hundreds of rounds per minute were traversing across the water, and there was no cover. None. There was nothing between a Marine standing in 4 feet of water 500 yards from the beach and the Japanese guns that were trying to kill him, except open water. Men could not run. You cannot run through chest-deep water. You can barely walk. You can push forward with enormous effort, leaning into the water, lifting your legs, trying to keep moving, while around you the surface erupts with bullet impacts, and men fall and do not get up, and the men who fell were simply gone. If they were hit badly enough and went underwater, they drowned. Even if they were only wounded, the effort of staying upright in the water with a wound while weighed down by equipment was in many cases impossible. The wounded, who could not stay standing, drowned alongside the dead. The survivors pushed forward, yard by painful yard. Some accounts describe men walking for 15 or 20 minutes through continuous fire to cover those few hundred yards. A distance that under any other circumstances would take less than 2 minutes. Every step was an act of will against physics and terror, and the absolute knowledge that the fire sweeping the water was lethal, and that it was finding men to your left and to your right. You kept moving, because stopping was dying faster. Moving was at least the possibility of reaching the seawall, of finding cover, of surviving another minute. The psychological weight of those yards is almost impossible to convey. Military historians who have interviewed survivors consistently report that the men who crossed the reef on foot at Tarawa describe it as the longest and most terrifying experience of their lives. Not the fighting on the beach, not the 3 days of brutal close combat that followed. Those few hundred yards of open water, that was the thing that never left them. Correspondent Robert Sherrod, who was there, later wrote that the water was dotted with dead and dying Marines. He said the beach itself was so heavily defended that men who made it to the seawall could barely look up without being shot. But to get to the seawall, they first had to cross that reef, and they crossed it in conditions that violated every assumption the planners had made and defied the courage of men who had signed up to do exactly this kind of thing. They crossed it and they died, and they kept crossing it anyway. The numbers tell part of the story. The 2nd Marine Division suffered approximately 3,000 casualties at Tarawa. Of those, roughly 1,000 were killed in action. The battle lasted 76 hours. When you do the arithmetic, That works out to a rate of casualties that shocked even the senior officers who had ordered the assault. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, received the initial casualty reports, and his staff was deeply concerned about the public reaction. These were losses on a scale that Americans had not yet been conditioned to accept, extracted from an island that most people had never heard of in a battle that lasted barely 3 days. Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, later said that Tarawa was the toughest battle in Marine Corps history up to that point. He was not exaggerating. But here is the thing about those numbers that the raw figures do not capture. A disproportionate share of those casualties occurred in the water. In the approaches. On the reef. Before the Marines had even reached the beach. Men who never got to fight, who never got a chance to use their weapons, who died in the water because the landing craft could not float over 3 feet of coral. The reef was not a natural disaster. It was a planning failure amplified by nature and paid for in marine lives. To fully understand what happened, you have to look at the boats themselves. The LCVP, the Higgins boat, was the workhorse of Allied amphibious operations across every theater of the Second World War. It was a 36-foot flat-bottom boat with a drop ramp at the bow, driven by a single propeller. It could carry a platoon of 36 Marines, or a jeep, or a small artillery piece. It was designed specifically for beach assaults. Andrew Higgins, the New Orleans boat builder who designed it, had argued fiercely with the Navy to adopt it. And he won, and the boat proved itself at Guadalcanal and in North Africa and in the Mediterranean. General Dwight Eisenhower would later say that Higgins was the man who won the war for us. The boat was that important. But the Higgins boat had one critical limitation. It needed water. Specifically, it needed at least 3.5 feet of water under its keel when loaded. On a normal beach approach with a good tide, that was not a problem. You ran the boat in fast, dropped the ramp in the shallows, and the men were only a few feet from the beach when they went into the water. At Tarawa, with a neap tide producing 3 feet or less over the reef that extended hundreds of yards from shore, the Higgins boat was effectively useless as a direct assault vehicle. It became a bus that stopped at the wrong stop and let its passengers off in the middle of a killing ground. The LVT, the landing vehicle tract, was a different story, and it demonstrated exactly what the difference meant in human terms. The LVT had been designed in the late 1930s, inspired by a swamp vehicle developed for rescue operations in the Florida Everglades. It was not primarily intended as a combat assault vehicle. It was meant for logistics, for moving supplies from ship to shore in difficult conditions. But at Guadalcanal, Marines had used them in limited numbers and seen their potential. By Tarawa, the 2nd Marine Division had 75 LVTs available. 75. For an assault that ultimately required hundreds of craft. They were enough to carry the first 3 assault waves, and those waves, while suffering terrible casualties from Japanese fire, at least reached the beach. The Marines who crossed the reef in LVTs had a fighting chance, because the LVT crawled over the coral and kept going. It was not fast, it was not armored against anything heavier than small arms fire in most configurations, but it moved, and it delivered men to the beach. The men in the Higgins boats that came behind were less fortunate. The brutal mathematics of Tarawa are essentially a study in what happens when you run out of LVTs. The Marines who made it to the beach were pinned behind the seawall, and in some cases behind wrecked vehicles and the bodies of their comrades. The fighting that followed was some of the most savage of the Pacific War. The Japanese positions had to be taken one by one. Bunkers were cleared with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and direct fire from tanks when the few Sherman tanks that made it ashore could be brought to bear. The close combat on Becchio was brutal in a way that goes beyond the clinical language of military history. It was men fighting at distances measured in feet, sometimes in inches. Grenades thrown into slits and openings, rifles and carbines fired through apertures. The sound of the fighting was continuous and overwhelming. And through all of it, the assault waves kept coming, kept crossing the reef, kept dying in the water and on the beach and pressing forward. By the end of the first day, the situation was so desperate that Major General Julian Smith sent a message to General Holland Smith, his corps commander, that said, "I am calling on you now." He was asking for the reserve regiment. He was not sure the Marines on the beach were going to be able to hold, let alone advance. The reserve, the 6th Marines, went in the next day, and they went in across the reef, and they experienced exactly what the earlier waves had experienced. Some of their craft grounded on the reef, and men went into the water under fire. The lessons of the first day had not changed the physical reality. The reef was still there, the tide was still inadequate, the Japanese guns were still firing, men still died wading in, but reinforcements changed the arithmetic on the beach, and by the second day, the Marines had enough men ashore and enough momentum to begin systematically dismantling the Japanese defenses. It was brutal and slow and costly, but it was forward movement. By the third day, it was essentially over. The Japanese garrison had fought almost to the last man. Of the 4,500 defenders, approximately 41 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. It had been a fight to the annihilation of the defenders, and it had cost the attackers a price in blood that reverberated all the way to Washington. The political aftermath of Tarawa was significant. When the casualty figures became public, and when photographs of dead Marines on the beach began to circulate in late 1943, the American public was shaken. The war bond rallies and the newsreel footage had prepared people for the idea of fighting, but the scale of loss at Tarawa from such a tiny piece of ground in such a short time was jarring. There were questions in Congress about whether the assault had been necessary, whether it had been well planned, whether the lives had been spent wisely. The debate continued for decades after the war. Military historians still argue about whether Tarawa could have been bypassed entirely and isolated by air power and naval blockade, or whether the airfield on Betio was essential enough to the campaign in the Gilberts to justify the assault cost. But in November 1943, the strategic logic was clear to the commanders. The airfield had to be taken, and to take it, the beach had to be assaulted, and to assault the beach, men had to cross the reef. The question was always whether they could cross it at an acceptable cost, and the answer that November morning was brutal. The military lessons of Tarawa, however, were absorbed with a speed and seriousness that is remarkable even by the standards of wartime adaptation. The Marine Corps and the Navy looked at what had happened and immediately began changing how they planned and executed amphibious assaults. The first and most urgent lesson was the LVT. Tarawa proved beyond any possible doubt that landing craft that could cross reefs and coral under their own power were not optional extras for Pacific amphibious operations. They were essential. The production of LVTs was dramatically accelerated. By the time of the next major amphibious operation in the Central Pacific, the assault on Kwajalein in February 1944, the Marines and Army had hundreds of LVTs available. The infantry was no longer dependent on Higgins boats for the assault waves. LVTs carried the first waves and the second waves and kept going, and Kwajalein, which was expected to be another bloodbath, was taken in 4 days with far lower casualties relative to the force employed. The same lesson was applied and reapplied at every subsequent operation. At Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the LVT became the foundational vehicle of Pacific amphibious warfare precisely because Tarawa had demonstrated, in the most unambiguous possible terms, what happened when you crossed a reef without them. The second lesson was naval gunfire support. The bombardment at Tarawa had been impressive in volume, but inadequate in duration and precision. The Japanese positions that needed to be destroyed were specific, identifiable targets, and they needed to be hit with enough concentrated fire to actually destroy them, not just suppress them temporarily. At Tarawa, the bombardment lasted about 2.5 hours before the first wave landed. At subsequent operations, the pre-landing bombardment was extended to days in some cases, and conducted with far more attention to hitting specific targets rather than simply saturating the island. Naval gunfire spotting procedures were revised. The coordination between air, sea, and ground elements was dramatically tightened. The lessons cost lives to learn, but they were learned. The third lesson was tidal intelligence. After Tarawa, the Navy put serious resources into understanding tidal patterns at planned assault locations. Underwater demolition teams, the forerunners of the Navy SEALs, were developed and deployed specifically to conduct reconnaissance of beaches and reefs before assaults. These men swam in close to enemy-held shores in small numbers, studying the approaches, identifying obstacles, measuring water depths, and in many cases placing demolition charges to blow gaps in barriers and underwater obstacles. The UDTs became a standard element of amphibious planning after Tarawa. Their job was precisely to prevent the commanders from being surprised by conditions that should have been known in advance. The intelligence failure at Tarawa, the failure to know with precision what the tide would do on the morning of the assault, drove directly and specifically to the creation of an operational capability that the United States military still maintains in modified form to this day. The fourth lesson was communications. At Tarawa, the command structure nearly broke down completely in the first hours. The division commander, General Smith, was aboard ship and had virtually no reliable communication with his units on the beach. The radios were waterlogged. The men who carried them were dead or wounded, or had gone underwater getting to the beach. For most of the critical first few hours, Smith was operating essentially blind, receiving fragmentary and often contradictory reports, and unable to exercise effective command. He sent staff officers to the beach to see what was happening and report back, a solution that worked as well as it could, but was nowhere near adequate. The communications failures at Tarawa drove major improvements in the waterproofing of radios, the procedures for establishing communications from ship to shore, and the development of dedicated command vessels that could operate closer to the action. The Navy LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, was adapted in some configurations as a command and fire support vessel specifically because of lessons learned at Tarawa and subsequent operations. These changes were not minor. They were fundamental to how amphibious command and control functioned for the rest of the war. There is another dimension of what the Marines discovered at Tarawa that does not always receive the attention it deserves. They discovered the limits of their own assumptions about what men could be asked to endure and still function. The psychological experience of crossing the reef under fire, of watching men die around you in the water, of reaching the beach only to find yourself pinned behind a log seawall with no cover and no clear picture of what was happening anywhere else, was an extreme stress test not just of physical courage, but of unit cohesion, leadership at every level, and individual will. What the after-action accounts consistently reveal is that the tactical situation at Tarawa was so chaotic and the casualties so immediate that the normal structure of command frequently ceased to function at the company and platoon level. Officers were killed crossing the reef or in the first minutes on the beach. Sergeants took over companies. Corporals led platoons. Private soldiers made tactical decisions that would normally have been made by officers because there were no officers left to make them. The Marine Corps system of developing initiative at every level of command, the NCO culture of producing men who could act decisively without supervision, was stress-tested at Tarawa in conditions that would have broken a less professionally prepared force. And in the most fundamental sense, it held. Men who had lost their officers kept fighting. Men who had lost their units attached to other units and kept pushing. Men who were separated, cut off, pinned down, and facing an enemy who intended to fight to the last, somehow found the will to keep moving forward toward a beach that was trying very hard to kill them. The specific experiences of individual Marines at Tarawa illustrate this in ways that no aggregate statistic can. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon of San Antonio, Texas, was in one of the assault waves that landed on Red Beach 2. He was a combat engineer. His LVT was hit by Japanese fire, and he was wounded before he reached the beach. He made it ashore and immediately began attacking Japanese emplacements with demolition charges while under constant fire. He was wounded again. He kept going. He covered the withdrawal of other Marines who were pinned down, drawing fire on himself. He was wounded a third time. He went back into the water to help wounded Marines reach the shore and keep them from drowning. He died before the day was over, but was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation describes a man who, having already been wounded multiple times and having every justification to seek shelter, instead chose to remain in exposed positions, attacking the enemy and protecting his fellow Marines. Bordelon was one of several Medal of Honor recipients at Tarawa. But what his story illustrates is not simply personal heroism, though it was clearly that. It illustrates that the disaster of the reef crossing did not break the Marines. It drove some of them to acts of extraordinary self-sacrifice because the situation demanded it, and because they were the kind of men who responded to that demand. The Corps had built men like Bordelon precisely for situations like Tarawa, and they were discovering, in the worst possible way, what those men were capable of. Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup was another figure whose actions at Tarawa defined what leadership looked like when the plan had completely fallen apart. Shoup commanded the assault on Red Beach 2 and Red Beach 3. He was wounded crossing the reef, but made it to the beach and established a command post under the seawall. With communications down, with units scattered and intermixed, with casualties mounting, and the tactical situation confused to the point of chaos, Shoup became the organizing principle of the assault on his sector. He moved along the seawall, assessed what he had, directed men where they needed to go, and maintained some semblance of tactical coherence when everything around him was disorder. His famous message back to the command ship, he reported that he was having one hell of a time, but that he thought they were winning. He survived Tarawa and was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. He went on to become Commandant of the Marine Corps, one of a small number of men who led from Tarawa to the highest ranks of the service. His legacy is inseparable from that 76-hour battle and from what it demanded of anyone who led men through it. The Japanese side of Tarawa also reveals something important about what the Marines discovered when they finally crossed the reef and seized the island. What they found on Betio was a construction project of extraordinary scale and discipline. The fortifications were not improvised, they were engineered. Many of the main defensive positions had been built with the kind of care and precision that would have done credit to a permanent military installation on home soil. The main gun positions were sited for interlocking fields of fire. The beach obstacles were designed to channel attacking forces into zones covered by the heaviest weapons. The interior defensive positions were arranged to maintain a defense in depth so that if the perimeter were breached, the attacker would still face organized resistance further inland. The Japanese engineers who designed Betio's defenses understood amphibious warfare. They had studied it. They had considered exactly the scenario of an American landing force trying to storm the beach, and they had built their position to defeat it. The reef was an integral part of their defensive plan. They understood, as clearly as Major Holland had, that the reef would stop landing craft and force men into the water, and they had positioned weapons to exploit exactly that vulnerability. They were right. The reef was exactly as dangerous as they had anticipated. The difference was that the Marines kept coming anyway. Understanding the Japanese defensive doctrine at Tarawa also illuminates why the bombardment, as massive as it was, could not guarantee success. The fundamental assumption behind naval gunfire support in the Pacific at this stage of the war was that enough shells hitting a small enough island for long enough would destroy or disable the defenses sufficiently to allow an assault to succeed with acceptable casualties. Tarawa revealed that this assumption was inadequate. The Japanese had built their positions with exactly this threat in mind. Concrete and coral and thick logs could absorb enormous punishment. The most sophisticated defenses had multiple layers of protection and redundancy. Even damaged positions could continue to fight. Even reduced garrisons could inflict catastrophic losses on attackers. The answer, as the subsequent campaigns would demonstrate, was more fire of longer duration, better targeted, combined with the ability to suppress and destroy specific positions during the actual approach and landing phase. But at Tarawa, the understanding of exactly what it took to suppress a prepared Japanese beach defense was still being developed in real time, and the cost of that educational process was measured in marine lives. The coral reef itself, the physical feature that stopped the boats and forced the men into the water, became a focus of intense study after Tarawa. The specific characteristics of coral reefs as obstacles in amphibious operations had simply not been adequately studied before the war. The Navy had extensive knowledge of reefs as navigational hazards to ships, but very limited knowledge of how they behaved as obstacles to landing craft and infantry in assault conditions. The tidal behavior of reefs, the way the water depth varied not just with the tidal cycle but with wind, barometric pressure, swell, and the specific geometry of the reef itself, was not well understood in an operational planning context. After Tarawa, the Hydrographic Office and the Navy's oceanographic resources were focused on this problem. The science of predicting water depth over reefs in specific tidal conditions at specific times was developed with the urgency that only combat experience can provide. The men who studied this problem after Tarawa were not doing academic research. They were trying to prevent what had happened from happening again. There is a broader historical lesson embedded in the story of Tarawa that goes beyond the specific tactical and operational details. It is about the relationship between planning and reality. Every amphibious operation is a plan built on assumptions, and every assumption is a potential catastrophe if it proves to be wrong. The planners of the Tarawa assault were not incompetent. They were experienced professional officers working with the information available to them and making reasonable judgments about what they expected to find. Major Holland's warnings were available to them, and some of them took those warnings seriously. But the institutional momentum of a major amphibious operation, the logistical and operational complexity of moving thousands of men and hundreds of ships into position for a specific assault on a specific date, creates enormous pressure to maintain the plan as developed. Changing the plan at a late stage is extremely difficult and carries its own risks. The planners had a tidal calculation they believed in. They had an assault plan they believed in. They had a confidence, based on the scale of the bombardment they intended to deliver, that the Japanese defenses would be sufficiently degraded. They were wrong about the tide, and they were wrong about the bombardment, and those two errors compounded each other in the most lethal way possible. The lesson the Marine Corps drew from this was not that planning was futile or that assumptions were always wrong. The lesson was more specific and more useful. It was that the assumptions most likely to be fatal were the ones about the physical environment of the assault, the ones about terrain and water and weather, and that these assumptions required the most rigorous possible validation before the operation launched. The tactical and operational lessons of Tarawa drove the development of beach reconnaissance, underwater demolition, and hydrographic surveying as operational priorities in amphibious planning. The answer to the problem of planning assumptions was more and better intelligence gathered by men who went to the actual place under actual conditions and reported what they actually found. It was not a complicated lesson, but it was an expensive one to learn. The legacy of Tarawa, in the history of the Marine Corps, is complicated and significant. On one hand, the battle is held up as an example of the Corps at its finest, of men accomplishing an extraordinarily difficult assault against a brilliantly defended position, with courage and determination that overcame tactical disadvantages that should have been fatal. On the other hand, the battle is also a case study in the cost of inadequate planning, of the consequences of dismissing expert warnings, and of the dangers of overconfidence in the ability of firepower to prepare the way for infantry. Both things are true simultaneously, and both are important. The Marines who died on the reef and the beach at Tarawa were not let down by their own courage or capability. They were let down by assumptions that proved to be wrong, and they paid with their lives for those errors, while simultaneously demonstrating a quality of individual valor and unit cohesion that remains remarkable, even by the extraordinary standards of the Pacific War. The tension between those two realities is what makes Tarawa such a persistent and important subject in military history. The physical evidence of what the Marines found at Tarawa, the fortifications, the weapons positions, the beach obstacles, the seawall they sheltered behind, tells its own story. After the battle, American engineers and intelligence officers went through Betio systematically, documenting everything. The sophistication of the Japanese defenses impressed and sobered the Americans who studied them. The main defensive positions that had survived the bombardment were photographed, measured, and reported in detail. The reports went directly into planning for future operations. The specific characteristics of Japanese defensive construction, the types of material used, the thickness of overhead cover required to survive naval gunfire, the sighting of weapons for mutual support, all of this was documented from Tarawa and incorporated into the planning for subsequent assaults. In a grim sense, the Japanese who died defending Betio continued to teach the Americans how to fight after they were dead, because their fortifications were a textbook of exactly what the Marines would face at the next island, and the one after that, and the one after that. The wrecks on and around Betio have become, in the decades since the battle, a kind of underwater museum of what happened there. The landing craft that were sunk in the approach, the tanks that drove off the pier and went to the bottom, the equipment and weapons that went overboard or were abandoned, all of it has settled into the shallow waters around the island and remained there, slowly being claimed by coral and marine growth. Divers who have visited the site report an eerie combination of tropical marine beauty and historical horror. Tanks sitting on the reef floor, anchors and machinery scattered across the coral, and in some places, unexploded ordnance still visible on the bottom, a reminder that the battle is not entirely in the past, even when the water is clear and the fish move silently through what was once a killing ground. The island of Betio today is inhabited and part of the independent nation of Kiribati. It has changed significantly since 1943. Land reclamation has altered the shoreline. The jungle of coconut palms that once provided the construction material for many of the defensive positions is largely gone. The beaches have shifted, but elements of the original Japanese fortifications are still present. Concrete bunkers, gun platforms, and defensive walls can still be found on the island, slowly deteriorating in the equatorial heat and salt air, but still recognizable as what they were. They are memorials of a kind, unintended and unpretty, to the men who built them and to the men who died trying to get past them. For the families of the men who died at Tarawa, the battle had another dimension that lasted long after the fighting ended. Many of the Marines killed at Tarawa were buried on the island in temporary graves, marked with improvised markers. After the war, a major effort was made to recover those remains and provide proper burial. But the effort was not entirely successful. Many of the men killed in the water were never recovered at all. Their bodies were carried away by the currents or sank in conditions that made recovery impossible. Many of those buried on the island were interred in mass graves or individual graves that were later lost when the landscape was disturbed by post-war construction and development. The question of the missing Marines of Tarawa became a persistent and painful issue for families and for the Marine Corps. In relatively recent years, organizations dedicated to recovering and identifying the remains of American war dead have worked on Bethio, using modern forensic techniques to locate and identify buried remains. This work has brought some resolution to some families after more than 7 decades of not knowing. It has also revealed, with a kind of grim precision, just how many men were lost in such a small area in such a short time. The density of remains recovered from a few hundred acres of ground is a measure of the intensity of what happened there that no statistical summary can quite capture. The question of whether Tarawa was worth it has never been fully resolved and probably never will be. The strategic argument for taking Betio was real. The airfield was important. The Gilberts,